Greetings to everyone. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to the second seminar of this academic year, organized by the Climate Change and Law Laboratory of Kadir University Law Faculty. Today we have a very special guest, Mr. Tim Crosland'i from UK. Mr. Crosland'i was previously a UK government lawyer who also provided legal advice to some of the small island states at COP21. He now spends most of his time either suing the government or being prosecuted by the government for actions relating to climate breakdown. Mr. Crosland'i, I would like to thank you so much for accepting our invitation. We are very honored to host you in our seminar series. I know that you have a different view with regard to practicing law and defend that lawyers cannot confront the climate crisis simply by acting as traditional lawyers. We are really very excited to listen your ideas and experiences from this perspective and look forward to hear what you mean with the climate breakdown, the right to life, and the right to rebel. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you so much for inviting me. And it's a real pleasure and privilege to be talking to people in Turkey and Istanbul. It's the first time that I've done that. And just to say that one of the things I asked myself in preparing to talk to you was, to what extent do I try and adapt what I say to the context in Turkey, to the political context in Turkey, because it's different from the context we have in the UK. And what I ended up thinking was I just can't really do that because I don't know enough, I don't understand enough about what's happening in Turkey. And so that all I can really do is speak from my perspective in the UK, and then leave it to you to interpret how that may or may not apply to a different context. So that in that sense, maybe we'll come to it in the questions afterwards, with all of us in this seminar, we're both students and teachers at the same time. We're both learning and exchanging things. And what I'd like to do is bring up a presentation. Just share my screen here. And it's just going to take a little bit of time to load up. So climate breakdown, the right to life and the right to rebel. Can almost sound a bit of a contradiction in terms, that idea that law could lead to breaking the law in some circumstances. But we're seeing this happening around the world. We're seeing people take action, direct action, civil disobedience. And that's partly what I want to talk about. And just to begin with this photograph of Francesca Chagas dos Santos from Brazil. The reason I've included her picture here, just think when lawyers talk about the climate crisis, we're very often doing it from an insulated position in society. And that discussion can end up being quite technical and maybe quite removed from the reality that people are experiencing now, not in the future. The tens of millions of people who've been displaced in Pakistan through the floods attributable to climate change, the 150 million people exposed to extreme hunger at the moment in East Africa, where the longest drought in that region's history is in full flow. And so it just seems to me it's important we feel the eyes of people upon us who are on the front line now, and that will maybe prevent us getting too lost in legal discourse that's too removed from what's really going on. And what can we do about the situation we find ourselves in? And I'm starting here with a quote from a young person in the UK who's saying, when I think about climate change, I ask, what's the point of anything? What's the point of my education? And that feeling of overwhelm that a lot of young people have, in particular, at least in the UK, but I think internationally as well, when they hear what the science is telling them, can stop people doing anything and can lead to a sense of resignation. And so the first objective, as I see it, is to try and understand properly what's going on. And this is the quote from an old quote from Paulo Freire, a Brazilian educator from the 70s. And he talks about surmounting the situation of oppression. I think this is an oppressive situation for people when they think about it. We need to understand it so that we can change it. And I think the same thing applies to law. Before we come to the legal principles and how those apply to the facts, we need to make sure we've got some understanding of the facts. So in the first part of this presentation, I'm going to focus on the situation that we're in according to science. And to frame that within the bigger picture of our collective story on this planet. Part of the reason for doing that is sometimes the discourse ends up veering towards, well, isn't it inevitable that human beings were too selfish? We're just going to destroy everything, aren't we? That's just our nature. And I don't think that is correct. Again, I think that can stop us from taking action. It can stop us from believing we can do anything. And it's just worth locating these last couple of 100 years in that wider story. Humans have been around for 2.5 million years. Homo sapiens for 200,000 years. And this industrial revolution that begins in 1750, led by the UK, with coal providing the primary source of energy for the Industrial Revolution. This is just a sort of blink in the eye of human history, but it's incredibly significant. And just look at this graph here. It plots this exponential rise of gross domestic product, which is our main economic measure, with carbon dioxide emissions. And you see them going up in lockstep with each other from around 1750. Economic growth and global carbon emissions. So those stories, it's difficult to separate them. And that's maybe why this is such an intractable problem, because all our politicians are simultaneously talking about two things. We need more economic growth, but we need less carbon emissions. And there's very little discussion, or relatively little discussion, about the difficulty of pursuing those two things. In other words, of bringing that red line of carbon emissions down very sharply, while that black line of economic growth, global economic growth, still rises. And one way of interpreting that graphic there is it's going to be extremely difficult to do those two things. Another part of just understanding the factual basis before we get to the legal principles, key idea in law, mens rea, guilty knowledge. Who knew what and when? So I think it's just interesting to ask, when was the greenhouse gas effect first theorized? That's the basis of climate change. Put more carbon into the atmosphere, traps more heat. And the answer is 1824. First time this is discussed by Joseph Fourier, a French mathematician. By the 1850s, John Tyndall, an Irish physicist, is demonstrating the greenhouse gas effect with his spectrophotometer. 1917, Alexander Graham Bell. He's mainly famous as the inventor of the telephone, but he's saying this is more than 100 years ago now. The unchecked burning of fossil fuels will have a sort of greenhouse effect. And he proposes the use of alternative energy forms such as solar. And then racing ahead, this is to 1980. Some brilliant investigative journalism, maybe I think this is around 2015, got hold of the minutes of the American Petroleum Institute from 1980. So this is an institute that brought big oil together. So Exxon, Texaco, Standard Oil, they were all there. And in the 80s, early 80s, they were still researching the climate crisis. As part of what they needed to do. It was their product. And these were their conclusions back then. Likely impacts: 1 degree rise by 2005, barely noticeable. 2038, 2.5 degrees, major economic consequences, major regional dependencies. 2067, 5 degrees Celsius, globally catastrophic effects. So that's what the industry itself was predicting in 1980. So not climate activists, not alarmists, the industry's own research. Then what Exxon does in 1982, you see the letter here, it decides to terminate its research program. And what happens instead, this is, I think it really starts in the 90s. Instead of research, Exxon and others put their money into PR. They employ the same PR experts that the tobacco industry employed to cast doubt on the link between tobacco and lung cancer. And now what they're doing, and here's an example, is putting out public information that casts doubt on climate science. Politicization stirs fears. And in fact, one of the things they talk about here, and this is correct, is the link between carbon emissions and economic growth. I mean, that's, as we've seen, that remains true. And look at the language here, proponents of the global warming theory. And as a result, we lose decades of opportunity to transition, as Alexander Bell had been urging in 1917. And this is a government official in the UK, 23rd February 2021. He's, this is again not an alarmist, it's a Whitehall, as we're described, Mandarin, a career civil servant. And he's describing the worst case scenario as sounding like this: much higher sea levels will take out most of the world's cities, much more extreme weather will kill more people than most wars have. The net effects will take out the infrastructure that our civilization and modern economy depends on. And then what he goes on to say is that based on the observations of the Environment Agency, the levels of floods we've been experiencing in the UK are more or less tracking that worst case scenario. In other words, that's what we're hitting. And what is happening more and more is that 1.5 thresholds that was established in the Paris Agreement, it's being recognized that we're not going to maintain that. I think that was the feeling coming out of COP27, and more scientists are being open about that, saying we've got to stop deluding ourselves. And Aslihan just mentioned at the beginning in her kind introduction that I was there in 2015 at Paris, acting as a lawyer for some of the small island states. And I remember what it was that gave rise to that 1.5 degree threshold and why it was recognized. The science that had been commissioned by the island states made it clear that they faced an existential threat if warming went beyond that limit, that they would, at least some of them, just disappear. And part of the argumentation in 2015, when there was pressure to sign an agreement that referred to the 2-degree limit, was island states saying, what you're asking us to do here is sign our own death warrant. You're trying to legitimize the 2-degree target, and you know what that means for us. It means we will cease to exist. How can you make us sign that? And we don't delude ourselves about the prospects. We understand, almost certainly we're racing beyond that level, but we want some accountability. We want it to be known. We want it to be on the record that you knew what it would mean if we went beyond 1.5 degrees. And we will not sign anything that doesn't acknowledge our right to exist. So when we say that 1.5 degrees is gone, that is not a light thing. You could say it is the most tragic thing, that our governments have failed us in that way. And let's remind ourselves of some of the implications according to the peer-reviewed science, just again, so we begin to face up to the consequences. Risks of simultaneous crop failure increase disproportionately between 1.5 and 2 degrees. So surpassing the 1.5 degree threshold will represent a threat to global food security. This was in 2019. And a lot of the time now what we're seeing is those scientific models, and we're seeing how they play out in reality. And just take this last year and the disruption to the wheat crop that's come out of the war in Ukraine. Russia and Ukraine, both major suppliers of wheat. And the thought was, well, maybe India can compensate in part for that disruption. India, one of the at least top 5 suppliers of wheat. Then the heat wave in India in April and May that caused disruption to India's wheat crop at the same time as the war in Ukraine. And all those people in the global south who are dependent on wheat as one of the staple products. And this is linking to the famine situations in East Africa, the famine situation in Afghanistan. So we're seeing this happening now. This is no longer just about, some distant future. As arguably, this is the most terrifying bit of the science. Peer-reviewed science that has said that the tropical regions of the world are going to be too hot to live in beyond 1.5 degrees of warming. And that's partly because the wet bulb temperature is then at risk of exceeding 37 degrees Celsius. beyond the capacity of the human body to cool itself down. The tropical regions of the world, that's home to 40% of the world's population, so 3.2 billion people. And if you're one of those 3.2 billion people, hearing that 1.5 degrees has gone, understanding what that means for you and for your family, you're going to be wanting to get out now before it's too late, because it doesn't make sense to wait. And by the time it happens, it's not going to be a good situation to be in. And then there's the small print about tipping points. And again, I don't want to take for granted what people know or don't know about the science. I don't want to repeat things people are already very familiar with. But this is just an example of something that came from the UK government in its net zero strategy from last year. Again, I'm going to keep saying this. This isn't activists saying it. This is conservative sources saying it. Above 1.5 degrees, we risk reaching climatic tipping points like the melting of Arctic permafrost, releasing millennia of stored greenhouse gases, meaning we could lose control of our climate for good. And that's one example, the melting permafrost, but just other examples of tipping points. So we see the temperature warm, we see more and more forest fires, and think about all that fire in the Amazon, and all of that carbon-based life going up into the atmosphere, compounding warming from our own emissions. Or as the sea ice melts, well, that sea ice has been reflecting heat away from the Earth's surface. As it melts and is replaced by dark seawater, more heat gets absorbed, meaning more ice melts and less is reflected away, and you get this kind of spiraling feedback effect. So that's why the 1.5 degree limit was in place in Paris. Not because it was a nice to have, not because we were going to be safe at 1.5 degrees, but because if you looked at that evidence, the consequences were dire, potentially dire. So when we're hearing that 1.5 is gone, that should be something we reflect on deeply, and reflect on what it is that got us into this position in the first place. And against that setting, let's now look at the legal implications. And starting with what in some ways is the foundation of the rule of law. To my way of looking at things, if we're serious about this idea of the rule of law and that nobody is above the law, well, we need to give primacy to international law, because otherwise, where do you get the legitimacy for a nation state? In our modern, interconnected 21st century, when what one state does affects another state, the only way that states are subject to the rule of law is if they're subject to international law. And the foundation of international law are these two principles that are really two sides of the same coin. The one that a nation state has sovereignty over its own people and resources. But the flip side of that is that a nation state doesn't do anything that has damaging effects on the sovereignty and integrity of other nation states. And the duty to prevent harm, that primary principle of international law, Well, it's relevant to the context of climate change, where the emissions and the historically high emissions in particular from the industrialized countries now threaten not just to harm and damage the territory, in many cases of those countries which have contributed least to the problem, but threaten to annihilate them altogether. And in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, you have direct reference to that legal principle. This is the preamble to the UNFCCC that's quoted here, recalling that states have, in accordance with the Charter of the UN and principles of international law, sovereign right to exploit their own resources, and the responsibility to ensure that activities within their jurisdiction or control do not cause damage to the environment of other states or of areas beyond the limits of national jurisdiction. Now, just speaking for the UK here, sometimes you might hear it said, well, the UK contributes only 1% of global emissions. Well, maybe that's true now. Obviously, it wasn't true historically. But the UK, as a post-industrial nation, a service sector nation, its real contribution now is its services industry, its finance sector, its insurance sector. The City of London supports 15% of global carbon emissions around the world. That's a huge amount. And the FTSE 100 share index, according to its own analysis, is driving the world towards, or consistent with, 4 degrees warming. In other words, our banks are profiting from this situation. Our financiers are profiting. Our lawyers are profiting from this. And we're allowing them to do it. And so you look at that principle of international law there, and you see that it's being breached. And without getting too much into other situations, let's take a situation where the international community as a whole sees no difficulty in describing a regime as lawful if there's been a military invasion of another country, and therefore delegitimizing actors within that country. Well, if other countries are pursuing a course of conduct that they know is going to destroy other countries and the territories of other states, why don't those same principles apply with equal measure? Is it not equally a deliberate and premeditated and conscious war of aggression? Violations of human rights. Again, just a sort of high-level picture here. Michelle, I think it's Bachelet, the UN human rights lead, has described the climate crisis and environmental threats as the greatest threats to human rights that we face. And in some ways, that's self-evidently true, as in if we don't have conditions which make the planet habitable, there aren't going to be any human rights at all. Specifically, the right to life, the right to family life, prohibition on inhuman or degrading treatment. When the science is telling us that on our current trajectory, there's going to be mass loss of life, there's going to be mass displacement of people, because, let's say, the tropical regions of the world will no longer be safe to live in. Very clearly, if you step back from it, a gross violation of fundamental rights. Just think of the conditions people are living in Pakistan at the moment. Maybe it's out of the spotlight now, but tens of millions of people affected. The reports, or some of the reports I've heard, are of families now having to choose between whether they feed a child or the cow that will provide food for other members of the family. These are the sort of choices that people are making. This is inhuman or degrading under any proper interpretation of what that means in law. Maybe let's just be a little bit more precise about what Strasbourg jurisprudence says. It talks about two aspects of human rights obligations. There's the negative aspect, let's call it, which is not to execute people, let's say, without authority. In other words, the state mustn't kill people. That's one side of Article 2, the right to life. But there's this other side, the obligation of the state to take positive measures to uphold the right to life. And that's really not controversial. That's well established in the Strasbourg case law. And part of that is this what's described as the framework obligation to put in place legislative and administrative measures to prevent, for example, industry emitting dangerous levels of carbon dioxide, to prevent banks and others from investments that are going to that are inconsistent with the conditions which make the planet habitable. And it's clear it's not happening. The other aspect of Strasbourg case law is you can't look at human rights obligations in a vacuum. You need to interpret them in light of other principles of international law. So that would apply, for example, to the Paris Agreement, which pretty much all states have signed up to. And a non-controversial interpretation of, let's say, the right to life would be governments have an obligation to take measures to limit warming to the 1.5 degree threshold in the Paris Agreement. But that's already gone. And so if we're looking at what's happening in terms of litigation around the world and climate litigation, I think that's maybe the first thing people think about when we talk about climate change in the law. What are the big climate cases? Well, it's an important year coming up next year. The Grand Chamber or the European Court has reserved to the Grand Chamber two major climate cases that invoke this positive obligation to safeguard life and the right to family life. And it was the European Court itself, in fact, who asked the Portuguese young people to provide evidence in relation to Article 3. I think that wasn't there originally in the pleadings. And the court said, well, what about Article 3, the prohibition on inhuman and degrading treatment? So that's part of what they will look at as well. And with Plan B, the charity that I work with, we've also got a case before Strasbourg at the moment relating to three young people, three British citizens. They all have family in the global south as well. So family in Ghana, in Nigeria, in Mexico. And part of our argument in that case is to look at what's happening to those people's families. One of the members of Plan B is a woman who was caught by Super Typhoon Ray in the Philippines last December. The Philippines, tens of thousands of people have lost their lives there already from the super typhoons that are turbocharged by all this additional heat in the atmosphere. Millions of people have been displaced. Sarah who's one of the Plan B trustees. She'd actually gone to the Philippines to see her family just before COVID and then couldn't get back because of COVID restrictions. And it was while she was there, she was hit by this typhoon and thought she was going to die, but survived and is now back in the UK. But in order to maintain her relationship with her family in the Philippines, she has to go back to the Philippines. And that's a hard thing for her to do after what happened. So it's an illustration of how this disrupts people's family lives within the jurisdiction when, you know, maybe this is a more common thing in the UK, but so many people here, you know, we have links all over the world, and in so many ways, this is a interruption of people's right to family life, and cultures that are being abandoned. But even if that's what we all, maybe let's put this another way. I've spent a lot of the last 6 years bringing climate cases. And I think that can be a really useful thing to do, partly because it shines a spotlight on things that are happening. We've used cases just to draw attention to the gap between or the gulf between what our government tells people it's doing and what it's actually doing. And when you bring a case, the government has to respond to that, and you confront the government with its own words. So when we brought a case against the expansion of Heathrow Airport, that case was really just built on the government's own words. You have told us that it's a catastrophe to go beyond 1.5 degrees. You have told us that you've assessed the implications of expanding Heathrow Airport and that it's consistent with your obligations. But your own evidence from your own analysis is telling us that Heathrow expansion means 40 million tons of carbon dioxide every year just from UK aviation by 2050. Whereas maintaining 1.5 degrees, according to your evidence, means zero carbon dioxide, net zero by 2050. Explain that. And that becomes very hard for them to explain. But there are a lot of cases around the world, and the direct gains in court have been quite marginal. So even take the Urgenda case in Holland, probably, you know, the most famous case in climate litigation, a successful case. The outcome was the court ordering the Dutch government to increase its emission reduction targets, I think, I might get this slightly wrong, but roughly to 20% by the year 2020, as opposed to 17%, on the basis the Dutch government had said it could do that anyway, quite easily. So quite modest. And there's a danger that if all we do is talk about climate litigation, when we talk about climate and the law, we end up with a sort of greenwashing where we distract from the bigger story, the real story. And I think there are so many zeros in this. You'll see there's a kind of image behind this slide. It's taken from some research by law students for climate accountability. They've been doing annual scorecards for leading law firms, the Vol 100. So a lot of those are international law firms based in the US. Quite a few of them are based in the UK. And they've shown it's not just billions, it's trillions of dollars of fossil fuel transactions those law firms have been supporting. And we hear all the time in the UK from our leading law firms about commitment to net zero, and these are the things we're doing to make our practice sustainable, and we're committed to the transition. The 2022 scorecards, the most recent one from a few months back, showed that in the period 2017 to 2022, it was $1.62 trillion worth of fossil fuel transactions that those top 100 law firms had supported, an increase of hundreds of billions from the previous year. So when you look behind that reality, I mean, you look behind the rhetoric and look at what the reality is, law firms are playing a massive role in what's happening, and it's mainly not a good one. So yes, let's talk about the climate litigation and that movement, but as long as it doesn't distract us from that part of the picture. And here's another part. The Energy Charter Treaty, and that's something that a lot of our governments have signed up to, that says if governments take action which threatens the profits of big fossil fuel companies, the fossil fuel companies can sue our governments and get damages. And the Energy Charter Treaty tribunals have not been public, not been open, but this recent analysis showed that more than $100 billion have been awarded to oil, coal, and gas companies by the Energy Charter Treaty tribunals. Governments having to pay those companies to compensate for their climate policies, which, if we look at, again, the reality of what is happening, global emissions of carbon dioxide keep rising. There's been no dent in that trajectory of carbon emissions with our 27 COPs at the UNFCCC, but somehow that still has resulted in vast payouts from our governments, from us, from taxpayers. Now, just imagine if this had been the other way round, that climate litigation cases had won $100 billion to go to those on the front line who'd lost their homes, who'd lost their families, who've lost their communities. Now, that would be a story. But instead, we're talking about these relatively minor victories, and very few people focusing their attention on this bigger picture. And what we're seeing even more through war in Ukraine is that those big oil companies who lied to us for so long, who misrepresented what they knew back in the 1980s, are making bigger profits than ever. And that the people in the UK, but around the world, who say this is not right, we don't agree with this, we don't agree with our governments ignoring the science and telling us they're on the case when the emissions and the reality shows that they're not. People who protest peacefully. In the UK, the climate protests have all been peaceful. I was at one point the police liaison officer for Extinction Rebellion, so I would go and speak to the police ahead of major events, and the police would say to us, "This is amazing, really, that there'd been 1,000 arrests, and not a single instance of assault. And that might seem quite modest, but the police know that arrest is a high tension situation, and it quite often escalates. So to have so many arrests and all non-violent, all peaceful is quite something. But nevertheless, the repression here in the UK just escalates and escalates, with support from the right-wing media that portrays young people, grandchildren, their grandparents as extremists. We've got legislation that came in this year that introduces a 10-year sentence of imprisonment for peaceful protest. It framed in incredibly broad terms, just any disruption to the public is the key test. So when we take those two sides of it, what our courts are doing, what's coming through the legal profession, this can just seem so profoundly wrong, because isn't it a basis of the law that it must be grounded in morality in some sense? I mean, we know, law and morals are not the same thing. We know it's courts of law, not courts of morality. But if we're legitimizing actions which, according to the science, are going to destroy more or less everything and the conditions which make our planet habitable, and we're imprisoning those people who stand up for the collective, then the law has lost its way. It's lost its purpose. And that's something we need to think about carefully. All of us who are part of the legal system, whether as academics or practitioners. And I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, it can seem almost like a contradiction in terms, this idea of a right to rebel. But it's interesting to remember the preamble to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, whereas it's essential, if man is not to be compelled to have recourse as a last resort to rebellion against tyranny and oppression, that human rights should be protected by the rule of law. So if, as we see, that isn't happening, isn't there a responsibility to stand up to that? And what I've put here in this slide, this is the British Medical Journal. So this is a well-respected scientific periodical. Again, not an activist publication. And we've got this article here, the doctors are getting arrested for climate change, a duty to resist. And this is, it happened last week. A group of doctors who blocked a bridge were acquitted by a UK court. And they talked about their duty as doctors to safeguard life. This is their professional obligation. They take the Hippocratic Oath. And if their evidence is telling them that this is the greatest threat to human health, well, isn't there an obligation on them as professionals to take action? And I feel that we in the legal profession need to take some inspiration from that too. And so this is what we're starting to do. I mean, maybe this is led from the UK. It's not only the UK. We've had lawyers sign this from Guyana, from Kenya, from Ghana, from Trinidad, from various places around the world, from the Netherlands. But 250 of us have now signed this letter, including a lot of King's Counsel, they're called in the UK. These are leading barristers. We, the undersigned members of the legal profession, support the contents of this letter in the light of substantial evidence that breaching the 1.5 degree temperature goal risks mass loss of life, and threatens the conditions for a stable civilization, including the rule of law. So this is a sort of variant of what the doctors have done. Ultimately, what we all serve as lawyers is the rule of law. And if that's under threat, then we have an obligation as lawyers to take action on that. And that letter is published, and people are interested in what lawyers have to say. It got a lot of publicity. It was published in the Times. Lots of comments from national newspapers. And of course, that's, only one part of it, but it gets those discussions going within the law firms who are supporting the fossil fuel sector. The young lawyers in those law firms read this and go, well, what am I actually doing here? What am I being asked to do? What does this mean for me and for my future? And so you create that tension within those law firms. A different context, this is from a legal protest earlier this year around conditions in the justice system in the UK, but very powerful, very effective when lawyers come together and take direct action. Everything comes through lawyers. It all passes through law. We're conservative by nature. So when lawyers take a stand in solidarity with the young people on the streets, in solidarity with the doctors who are taking action, very hard for the right-wing press to dismiss us as extremists. Because people don't believe that and know that we're conservative by nature. So what we're working on at the moment is a declaration where we go this step further from that initial letter and say, we refuse to act for new fossil fuel projects, and we refuse to be part of prosecuting those who are taking reasonable and proportionate protest measures. And that can sound like a very modest thing for us to do. It is a very modest thing for us to do in proportion to what's happening, all those things we've looked at. But potentially it puts us into conflict with our legal regulator, because we have something called the CAB rank rule in the UK for barristers that says you must take on any case within your competence. So to have lawyers saying, we are just not going to do that, we are not going to take on cases when the evidence tells us that in doing so, we will be creating severe jeopardy for our own lives, for our children, for the people that we care about. We will not do that. And our declaration is supported by our right to freedom of thought and conscience and religion. That's Article 9 of the European Convention on Human Rights. And so if you take action against us, we will take you to the European Court of Human Rights, because it is a breach of our right to freedom of thought and conscience for you to make us do the unconscionable. And in that way, we hope to get people thinking about what our collective responsibilities are. So that's kind of what we're doing, or what I'm doing with others right now at the moment in the UK. And I'm going to stop there just to open this up. Like I said, I'm not assuming at any point that anything I say here is directly applicable to the context in Istanbul or in Turkey. It's much more sharing ideas that may or may not have some kind of resonance. But thank you very much. And my last slide here is just reminding us all what's happening, not in the future, not in some far distant place, but things that are happening now that we're all part of as members of the legal profession.
Yes, Mr. Crosland, thank you so much for this absolutely fascinating lecture and sharing your views. It was very interesting to hear the relationship of the finance sector and law sector with climate crisis. And now it is time to have the questions or any comments of our audience to you.
And we have one question from Yozeren Abunus. He wrote his question in the chat box and wanted me to read this question for him. The question is, how do you evaluate the attacks of climate activists to the artistic pieces in terms of right to rebel?
Yeah, well, so it's, again, it's interesting that that comes up, isn't it? Everybody's seen that. So this is a question, you know, my kids talk about at school, it comes up at school, so it gets people thinking, it gets people talking. And that's part of it already, I believe, when there's been so much suppression of the evidence and so much desire to be able to continue with business as usual. We've had decades of writing polite letters to those in power, had decades of climate marches. And there comes a point when we can see it's not working. And there is this very simple objective measure of whether things are working or not, which is looking at that trajectory of global carbon emissions, and they are still going up. And our lives are all on the line. Our futures are all on the line. So for me, answering that question as a lawyer, well, in most legal traditions, we acknowledge a right of proportionate self-defense, of raising the alarm. We've got case law in the UK from the 17th century, the fire of London. Normally, it's a crime to knock somebody's window in. But if you knock their window in because their house is on fire, and you're trying to get them out of there, that's not a crime. That's reasonable self-defense. So for me, when we see young people doing things that don't actually really cause any substantial harm, but force us all to ask questions such as, if we're getting this anxious about some soup on the glass of an oil painting, how are we going to react when the global food chain collapses? How are we going to react when 3.2 billion people lose their homes, when the extreme heat and storms knock out our infrastructure? Well, then we're asking the right kind of questions. So yes, I think, you know, one can take too seriously the soup on the glass of an oil painting. And of course, in ordinary circumstances, that would be a pointless thing to do. But why are we worried about that if we're not worried about what we can all see with our own eyes is happening now around the world on a far greater scale? So for me, it's about flipping that question and understanding we're not going to get anywhere by politely asking those in power to listen to the science, because we've been there and we've done it and it didn't work.
Thank you very much for the answer. Is there any other question or comment? For the time being, I think there is no. Mr. Crosland, maybe I can ask a question. You have really highlighted the real story of the climate change by explaining the finance sector, energy sector, and law sector all together, how they increase the problem. And what is your opinion or what realistic measures should be taken or can be taken in this regard? Will the finance sector stop financing the energy projects, or what kind of measures can be taken?
So I find this a difficult question when this comes up, because if we look at what the science is saying to us, we're going to have to transform our societies fast and comprehensively, and that's going to be difficult for so many people in so many ways, and there's not going to be a silver bullet solution. I mean, we know we've got to stop fossil fuels as soon as possible. We know we're addicted to them and we're dependent on them, and if we go cold turkey, we're going to die too, just to put it simply. So what we have to do is come together as a society and be honest about the situation we're in, to be honest about where we want to get to and how much we all want to make a future for our young people, whether we have our own children or whether we don't, whether it's our nephews and nieces or whoever it is, and make some incredibly difficult decisions. But what I believe we're trying to do is not tell people to go back to the Dark Ages, not tell people to give up the things that are so important to all our lives, but to help people understand what we're trying to do is save as much of modernity as we can. Because if our infrastructure collapses, we won't have the things we take for granted. We won't have modern medicine. We won't have modern communication abilities. The crash will be too deep and too sudden. So actually, the reality is we're trying to save as much as possible, not tell people to stop doing things. But the longer that graph goes up, impossibly high, the harder that fall is going to be. So I guess the one thing I would say, my belief is we need to be honest that we cannot have infinite growth on a finite planet. It's kind of happening anyway. In the UK, I don't know how much you're following it, but our economy has stopped growing. And a lot of economic growth is artificial. It's engineered through debt more and more, so it's not going to keep going up. But the more we try and force it up by pressuring our populations into more and more consumption, the harder that fall is going to be. So for me, the first step would be to acknowledge that we cannot grow our economies infinitely, and to ask what that really means, because in so many ways our economies have become dependent on growth as well as carbon emissions. Without growth, do we have high unemployment? Without growth, do we have a collapse of living standards? So the first thing I believe we need to do is say, how can we reorientate our economies so we're meeting everybody's fundamental needs while remaining within planetary boundaries? And there are lots of serious economists like Kate Raworth in the UK, Professor Jackson, who say, actually, that we can do that. But it requires a fundamental change in ideology. So the short answer to your question is that until we change that belief in infinite growth on a finite planet, which is kind of fantastical anyway, I don't think we're going to make much progress on this.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your answer. I think we come to the end of time allocated to us for this seminar. I would like to thank everyone in the audience and to Mr. Crosland for his presentation. I hope everyone enjoyed today's lecture, and I wish you stick with us on our next seminars. Please send us an email to ccllab@kahas.edu.tr if you wish to be included in our mailing list. And Mr. Crosland, before we finish, I would like to give the floor for your last words, for your closing words.
Okay, well, thank you very much, and thank you for having me again. And just to say, I'm very conscious that a lot of what's in that presentation is a bit bleak. It's a little bit, there's some hard things in there, but there's a quote that I believe is important from James Baldwin, the US civil rights activist, which is, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. So I think that's a key role for all of us in the academic community, just to help people face up to that reality, because unless we do that, and unless we confront some of the painful features of that, we're just not in a position to make the transformational change that's needed. So we've got to be willing to go through that pain, as it were. And thank you for allowing me to do part of that with you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Crosland. And now I'd like to say goodbye to everyone, and hope to see you all again. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.